This is an RNZ podcast.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Kathryn Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. Well, now, for some children, putting sounds and syllables together is very difficult. It's called childhood apraxia of speech and is different to other speech and language development issues such as stuttering. Wellington speech and language therapist Christian Wright is here to help explain. And don't forget to get those questions through to Christian. Text them 2101 or email us 9tanoon@rnz.co.nz. Morena, Christian, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very, very well, thank you. Please explain what it is, childhood apraxia of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the first thing I should probably say is it's very rare. So if you took 1,000 preschoolers, 1 or 2 of them may have childhood apraxia of speech. So just so that parents have that in their mind as we go through today, often childhood apraxia of speech, not only is it rare, but other conditions can look a bit like it. But essentially, it's had lots of names over the years: verbal dyspraxia, developmental verbal dyspraxia, but the current term is childhood apraxia of speech, and what it is 3 distinguishing features of it. So the first is inconsistency. So these are the kids when they are trying to speak and put sounds and syllables together. They find it very hard to be consistent because they're having enormous difficulty coordinating the plans to move the speech musculature of the mouth, so your tongue, your lips, and your jaw. So essentially, the messages that the brain is sending are getting disrupted and confused. So you can have children, like I had a boy the other day, he was trying to say the word bunny. And in the 10 to 15 minutes we were playing around with this word, he said bubby, nini, baba, bahi. So it kept changing. So you can imagine the frustration for a child and a family when they're trying to get, particularly with preschoolers, their first words. And often for the kids who have got to the point that they are putting a consonant and a vowel together, they feel like they're just never winning because it's going round and round in circles and it keeps changing all the time. So inconsistency is the first one. Secondly, these are the kids who have difficulty transitioning between the different sounds and syllables and the syllables and words. So these transitions, often they take longer than normal, they become disrupted. So their speech doesn't feel very continuous, like there's a good flow to it. It's stilted and it feels like they're producing it syllable by syllable. And then thirdly, their prosody. What we mean by prosody is how you place stress in words and the rhythm in your speech and the way you use pitch to go up and down to create emphasis and intonation. So these children have usually a very unusual prosody. Maybe their stress is very even across their speech. And their rhythm, as we've already talked about, is quite broken. So it creates a monotone, robotic sort of feel to their speech. But so those are the 3 features that we usually start by looking at. But there are some other things. For example, children with childhood apraxia of speech, they make many more mistakes in longer, more complex words and syllables, and their vowel accuracy is poor. And they sometimes have these tongue, lip, groping kind of behaviours where you can see as they're trying to imitate their speech that their tongue is worming around in their mouth and their lips are not sure whether to close or open or to make a flat shape or a round shape. So it looks very inconsistent as they're sort of reaching for these sounds and these words.
So it's a physical condition trying to coordinate. The intention is there, but somewhere between the intention and the wiring to the actual movements, there's an issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay, so what age typically it's present from birth if it's naturally acquired, right? Or if it's from birth.
It's
so when will you
right.
start to see? How early will you start to see this kind of evidence?
That is a very great question to ask, because I think this is one of the reasons why it sometimes can be overdiagnosed or missed altogether. It's a tricky condition to recognise, particularly in young preschoolers. But if we follow the typical path of our preschoolers and their development, we expect to see their first word when they're about 1. They've usually done babbling from 6 months up to that point. And so there are some early signs that would suggest to us that these preschoolers are going to maybe have suspected childhood apraxia of speech. So if we think about those early signs, it's things like in that 2 to 3 year age group, they've got a very limited range of consonants. So parents would often feel as though they don't seem to make a lot of sounds. And the sounds they do are very, very, they're usually like P's or B's, D's, M's, some of those lip together sounds that you see right at the beginning. And when you ask them about babbling, the parents have commented that they did a little bit of reduplicated babbling, that like ba, 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 but they never really moved on much to the varied babbling, like the ma, moo, the me, ba, do. You kind of sound like Jabba the Hutt when you talk like that, but that kind of thing. So they didn't really do a lot of that. And that the child's, what we would call their word shapes, so how they put consonants and vowels, consonants together, they tend to be very restricted, very small. And so these children land more on just isolated sounds, like they're trying to say more and they go, or they're saying up and they go, ah, like that. So it feels like everything's operating at a very simplistic level. And when I'm interacting with these kids in play, they're often very quiet. They don't tend to make a lot of sound, yet their understanding of language is usually pretty good, and it of course far exceeds their expression. So
it must be very frustrating, like any number actually of speech issues or communication issues. It must be very frustrating for the child.
It really, really is. It's really frustrating for them, and it's really heartbreaking for parents, because every parent wants to see their child succeed and win at the things they're trying at. And the underlying issue being that it's essentially a neurological motor, it's a motor-based issue, means that it's very, very, very difficult for this child to choose and sequence the blueprints that are telling their speech muscles, their tongue, lips, jaw, which direction to move, how quickly, how long, with how much pressure. Like they find it impossible to pull together these motor plans to then produce speech that their peers seem to be doing so effortlessly. And so often these kids will develop signs and gestures to try and communicate, because in many cases their cognition is normal, and they're trapped literally in their speech.
We will come to treatment, of course, but can we talk about diagnosis? You mentioned it's often misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, and some of the questions that have come in are about precisely this. One person saying, can apraxia be diagnosed in New Zealand? Who is able to do this? Are there people who can do it in Auckland as well as Wellington? Just pick up on what the process for diagnosis is.
So the process would be, usually a diagnosis is made by a speech language therapist. That's the usual port of call, because the condition is very much, it's a speech condition. Sometimes I have seen paediatricians give a preliminary diagnosis of it because the child maybe has some other features, not so much just about their speech, but perhaps they have another condition, developmental coordination disorder. So the child is showing signs that their motor development in general is very slow, and it's presenting in their speech. So a byproduct of, or a comorbid feature of the developmental coordination disorder being the childhood apraxia of speech. But many of the kids I work with have purely childhood apraxia of speech, and there aren't many of them. Like currently on my caseload, I have 2, so not many. And the diagnosis is tricky to arrive at, because although we can do it, it's somewhat constrained by the age of the child and what the child's willing to do. It all looks great in the literature when they say, okay, so you're going to do a syllable and a word repetition test, and you're going to do this test a couple of times because you're looking for the consistency issue. Are they able to be consistent in the production of the word shark? So the child attempts shark, then you go through the list. There's usually about 15 words on this list. Then you play for a bit, and then you revisit the list, and you see, are their productions the same again? So that's one thing you're looking at, the variability in their production. And you look at things like a language sample if they are speaking. You're looking at the syllable structures that they use. You're looking at the stress, the prosody, how they are sounding when they speak. You might do an oral motor exam. So what you're doing there is looking at how they're moving, their lips, their tongue, their jaw, what's going on inside their mouth. So there's lots of things that we look at to try and, I suppose, arrive at a point where we have a best guess as to what this might actually be.
Couple of questions before we get to the therapies, please. How is this different from aphasia, please, asks Jane.
Aphasia is not really an area I work in, but aphasia is usually an acquired condition. So I'm probably speaking a bit out of tune because it's a condition that's usually treated by speech therapists who predominantly work with adults. But aphasia, for example, is the result of a stroke. And what that can produce is, in effect, a dysarthria for some people. A dysarthria is actually a muscle weakness of the articulators. So those people have quite slurred speech. They also have issues with the way they're putting their sounds together, and there may be underlying issues with the motor programming of that as a result of the stroke. But the key difference is children who have childhood apraxia of speech do not have muscle weakness. They have an issue with the ability to pull together the correct motor programs in the correct sequence to execute speech.
And one asking here if there is any connection between autism and apraxia.
No, not necessarily. You can have the two. It's not uncommon to see children who have autism have childhood apraxia of speech. So one of the contributing factors to why their language development is going so slow is there could be this as an underlying condition. But hand on heart, it's pretty hard to work that out in children who are severely affected by autism. It's hard to get to the bottom of that one.
Can apraxia affect swallow cause intermittent choking episodes, affect swallowing cause intermittent choking episodes?
It's more usually an issue with if the child is having trouble with the coordination of their tongue. Sometimes we can have some children who may have some issues with the way that their tongue is manipulating the food in the mouth, that sometimes maybe the food does start to go down or the liquid goes down too quickly and can cause a coughing reflex. So the cough reflex is there to keep you safe so that the food and liquid doesn't go into your lungs and cause what they call aspiration pneumonia. But I mean, it's not really an area that I've had a lot to do with, I must say, and I haven't really had that as a problem with most of my clients. But in severe cases of childhood apraxia of speech, I remember many years ago, a lovely boy I worked with who had such a severe case of it that he literally drooled while we played together because he couldn't even form lip closure, and he did have some swallowing issues as well.
This is interesting because the same emailer asks, can excessive intermittent drooling be connected to apraxia?
Yes.
And has children both showing signs age 3 and 5. Let's get to what you can do, please.
Sure. So there are treatments available, and I think what might be helpful is just to go through severity, because the treatments look slightly different based on that severity. So children who have mild childhood apraxia of speech, they're usually slow to develop their first words, their single word acquisition is also slower. So it looks a bit like a language delay, but also they characteristically have fewer sounds than their peers, and they make far more sound errors. And as they get older, their intelligibility becomes an issue. So it's harder to understand them. They have difficulty learning new words when the words particularly are multisyllabic, and they sound quite flat and quite monotone. So those are your mild kids. And because childhood apraxia of speech isn't just a severe condition, it's a continuum, and there are different children affected differently along it. So there are treatments available. So, for example, although I won't go into the detail of the treatments too much, because obviously parents would need the support of a speech therapist to implement them, but the rapid syllable transition training approach, that's a great approach. It comes out of Australia, and Tricia McCabe is the person who put that together. I think that's her name. She has some really, actually online, there is a whole explanation of it, and it's a free resource for speech therapists, but parents equally can have a look at it to see what it's about. But and that really is a treatment that focuses on the use of these non-words, these silly sort of syllable combinations like kuba or difa. And what you're teaching is you're focusing the child on transitioning between the sounds and the syllables whilst also working on their prosody. And I think the thing that's important is, whether it be mild, moderate or severe, the thing you're looking for when you're working with children who have childhood apraxia of speech is, although on the surface it sounds like they have a clarity issue, therapists are always trying to keep in mind and remember, and parents, it's important for them to know, you're not trying per se to treat the sounds, you're trying to treat the underlying motor program issue. So the treatments are focusing on the difficulty of the speech motor planning. And so you're spending more time looking at how the child transitions between sounds and syllables and how continuous it sounds. And of course, the accuracy is in there as well. But you're trying to work hard in the therapy to keep thinking about how can I help you to put your blueprints for speech together in such a fashion that we are helping you to overcome this planning issue rather than worrying about whether you can say k or t. It's more about therapy at the syllable level and the word level.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you go ahead, Kathryn.
I was just going to say what kind of progress and trajectory, but you carry on with what happens.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go, actually, that when you get into the moderate and severe cases, the progress and the trajectory slower, more protracted. So the moderate kids, the young kids who have moderate childhood apraxia of speech often only have a few words. They're often using gestures and signs when they're trying to communicate. As they get older, again, their intelligibility is very much decreased in their sentences and their conversational speech because of all the speech errors. And they sound very slow and effortful when they're talking, almost like a robot. And then the severe kids, they're often, when I meet them, say aged between 2 and 3, they're often not speaking at all. And it presents, so when I'm sitting in my clinic playing with a child, I'm thinking, you're not speaking at all. So what's going on? Is there an issue with, is it a language delay or disorder? Is it a severe speech sound issue? Is it childhood apraxia of speech? Are you on the autism spectrum? There's lots of things you're thinking when you're looking at someone who's not speaking. And often my cases who are very severe with childhood apraxia of speech, they usually don't have very many words, if any. Their sound repertoire is completely choked. It's often down to maybe 1 or 2 sounds, often an M, because it's easy to bring your lips together and hum. And they are heavily relying on gestures at that point. So if they're not affected to the point that their motor coordination with their hands, then I'll be using a lot of sign in the early days to get things moving so they've got something to go on with and begin to communicate with people. And there are other ways. There are picture boards and other things we can also be using to help them to get their message across, to take some of the pressure or the frustration out of communication for them. And as those kids get older, they typically, they have really obviously an obvious struggle to produce words and phrases. It's very hard to understand them, and treatment takes place over years. So a lovely boy I worked with years ago, he was a teenager by the time I finished with him, and how those young adults sound who have had severe childhood apraxia of speech, you meet them and you speak to them, they're a bit slower in the way they talk. They often sound like they have an accent, and that's because one of the sort of indelible marks that childhood apraxia of speech leaves is on your vowel system. So they sound a bit like, he sounded like he was from England because of some of his vowels. People often thought he was on his OE here. And as I said to him, well,
that's the least of your concerns, isn't it?
That's what I said to him.
That's pretty good.
You've got a lovely standard British English.
Yeah. So tell me, where you have over many years been able to get someone to this point, what is it that you've done, do you think? Have you, rather like thinking about the stroke victim, have you taught them an alternative pathway to doing something that most of us do this way? Yeah,
you have. You've had to, in the really severe cases, literally help them stitch together the neurological plans to be able to generate intelligible speech. But I would say a big part of what I do over the longer years is I walk the journey with the family of trying to keep it buoyant. It's so demoralizing at times. It's so hard. And the poor children, there's only so many games I have in my cupboard before they've played every game I own. And then you're into that territory of we've got to keep finding ways to keep you engaged and to help you on this path, because your wins do come, but they come so slowly and there's so much effort to get them. But the point that I always focus the family on and the parents on is we do get there. We generally do get there. And we literally drag the kid most of the time, kicking and screaming there, because understandably, humans don't like giving a lot of effort for seemingly very little return. But I often will go back and look with the children and the families when the children get older at old videos. So we'll sometimes do video of their speech and go back and go, whoa, look how you were talking then and look how you're talking now, because you lose perspective on it with the time that it takes.
Christian, is there financial public health funding support for this kind of intensive therapy?
No, it's such a can of worms, that one. There isn't really. I mean, obviously for my work, the families, they pay for it themselves. I have had some families, I don't know how they'd go about doing it. Some families I've had, they've had support through WINS. The Ministry of Education, obviously they provide speech language therapy, but that's
you've got to get all the diagnoses there, haven't you? Is the great challenge often, or not?
Yeah, and also just I think it's really difficult for the ministry therapists, their caseloads and the amount of time they can give to each of their clients and the intensity of therapy that's required for children who are severely affected by childhood apraxia of speech. I just haven't seen it. That's outside their remit. And look, even myself, I mean, there are constraints because although the literature might say 3 to 4 sessions weekly, so if you're in America, they have therapists who are attached to schools who in some cases see their kids 4 times weekly. That sounds wonderful. But in practice, what I know to be true is that children, they don't want to see you 4 times a week often. That's very intensive, and this is hard work that you're making them do.
Yeah.
So I always balance how the child's feeling about the therapy with the finances that are available. So there's a sort of trade-off there. And I may see children weekly, but I certainly don't see them 3 or 4 times a week.
Christian, thank you very much as always. Christian Wright, speech therapist.